Okay. We did it. Go team. Sorry. Or Phil. I'm sorry, man. Okay. I got you right in the middle of the.
I was scratching my head. Yeah.
Look at this. It was inglorious. I wanted to start exactly on 9 o'clock. I saw the seconds ticking down to the next minute. I'm like, I got to do this to him. I'm sorry. Hi. Welcome.
Hi. Oh, we've got a visitor.
Hi. Oh.
It's Coco.
Hi, Coco. So does Coco? Well, okay. I mean, actually, interesting question. How it was?
You can't actually see her because the screen's been truncated. That's fine.
I can see. Yeah,
you can. Okay.
Hiding behind the Dave name there. But is Coco post Spring Boot or?
Oh, let's see. Yeah, she's a bit younger than Spring Boot. It's a bit like having children, isn't it? She's younger. My actual daughter is a bit older than Spring Boot. How old are yours, Phil?
One is, I think, pretty much on Spring Boot because he's.
Yeah, I remember you having a baby when we were first working on it. I was just thinking that.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's the thing I used to judge the age of it because this is 10 years of the release, but I think we were working on it
a bit longer. Yeah. No, I sort of remember because we were both living in San Francisco for sort of at the beginning. I can't remember 2013ish, and I can't remember seeing you that much.
No,
must have been. I was trying to think why that was. I mean, like I didn't go to the office every day, like we did see each other, but I didn't think we saw each other that much. That's probably why.
No, I don't think that was for long either. I think you went back to.
I was there for like 2 months. Yeah.
Well, look at all these people joining us from all around the planet. I appreciate y'all. You two are joining us from around the planet. Well, Phil's rather like me. I guess you're in the Bay Area, and then and Dave, you're not.
I'm not. I'm in London, where I normally am. This is my lair.
Oh, is
that random cables and?
Oh yeah, is it your what's it? Not like a hub. Your where the magic happens?
Yeah, I suppose.
Okay, so let's so that people know. Like somebody's just asked, what are we going to talk about in today's session? That's a great question. Today we're 1st of April, not April Fools. Is hitherto and henceforth the birthday of Spring Boot 1.0. And this year marks 10 years since the first 1.0 GA release. Now it's not the first release of Spring Boot. I remember there's like a 0.4, 0.5. There's a number of releases that were not
just like with Spring Framework. There's a few dates I suppose you could identify as beginnings, but. There was a name change as well, wasn't there? We didn't call it Spring Boot at the beginning. I'm just trying to remember. I think I wrote that down.
I found an old one. It was called Spring Bootstrap and Spring Zero for a while.
Spring Go was actually the first commit, I think.
Oh, was it Spring Go as well?
Yeah.
Yes.
Chris Beams did that, right? Chris, you remember Chris was one of the first committers, probably the first. I can't remember.
Here's the
Spring Boot. The name Spring Boot. So it was Spring Zero for about 3 weeks. I looked it up for when Josh and I did that history thing for the keynote at
last year.
Spring One last year. We looked it up. So yeah, it was called Spring Zero for 3 weeks in 2013, and then at the end of July we called it Spring Boot.
Right, and then
people being involved in that. Adrian, Alexis, Brian, of course.
Brian Dussault, that is, yeah.
Yeah, Brian Dussault.
Speaking of the keynote from Spring 1 last year, who I don't know if people have seen this, but Spring 1.io, History of Spring, you can kind of trace the lineage of.
That's awesome.
It's
Who did this? Was it Chloe?
What?
Who did this thing?
Chloe and there's 2 other people, and it was a Skunksworks initiative, right? It was just something that was done by our amazing team.
No lawsuit coming.
No, it's like it's on Spring 1.io. It's great. So Spring Data, look at that. We've got Spring Boot 1.0, GA 2014, right? I don't know I guess we're underground. I don't know why Spring Boot is. I guess started from the bottom. Now we hear. I don't know what the and then batch. This by the way, Dave, we have questions about this.
That was me. Yeah, sorry.
Spring Irrigation
I think
4.0.
Spring Batch, the first Spring branded project that wasn't a Spring framework. I think.
Oh, really?
Spring Cloud in here as well.
Because Spring Security used to be called something else.
Basically Dave running around writing stuff.
And then we're in the cloud. So this is all Spring Cloud projects or Spring Cloud adjacent. So we're in the clouds. Hopefully it's not too subtle.
Very funny.
Now we're in the water, maritime themes, Kubernetes. That's a Greek word for like ship or something. Spring Cloud Skipper, gateway for Kubernetes. This is the modern era, Spring Boot 3. That was 2022. Spring Framework 6. And of course, everybody wins. And the production is in this castle, right? Don't have to go to another one. So okay. So that's where we are.
Gets hit with a sword. That's great.
Right. Just so we've come a long way. Yeah. So you're Dave Syer, Dr. David Syer. You're Phil Webb. You're the two co-founders of Spring Boot, and you measure the project's life by your progeny, right? The relative to your progeny, right? Because
that's what we were just talking about. Yeah. So mine was, I guess, 3 when I started working on Spring Boot.
Oh man, that's almost a good age to. I mean, traveling across the Atlantic in a country is always difficult, but especially if you have I think under 3 would be more.
We did have a bit of a black spot. We didn't go anywhere on an airplane when she was 2 because terrible 2s.
I cannot imagine. And then I have so many questions. Okay, so first of all, I mean the obvious things, like it's 10 years now. What was the genesis of the project though? Why did you do that? Why build this instead of building, I don't know, whatever. I mean, what was the what was the inertia? Like Dave, you were the founder and you were leading Spring Batch for a hot minute, and then you were working on Cloud Foundry for another few minutes, and then Phil, you were also doing that JavaScript thing with Jeremy and
the Wavefront, was it?
Wavefront. Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that was Phil. I was I just finished working in the Cloud Foundry team. I was looking for something to do.
So why?
There's a few origin stories, right? If we want to get nostalgic about it. The canonical one is related to a Jira issue, so Spring Framework Jira issue, where somebody sort of piped up and said, "Excuse me, why do I have to deploy it to an application server? What's the point of that? Can't I just run an application using Java?" And that seemed like a good idea to us. So we had an engineering meeting about it at Spring One, and when was it? 2012 was it? I guess probably. Yeah, I think so.
Was it Dallas?
Oh wow! I think it was
Washington. I think maybe.
Yeah, Washington. I was going to say and so a few people went away, said they'd think about it, and Chris Beams was one of them, and he was one of the first people to get involved. I can go back a little bit further than that, because in actually 2010, I was using Tomcat embedded in some demos that I did at Spring One. If you look back to that, I think it was Spring One Chicago. Maybe that was where I met you, Josh. So it all hooks together, doesn't it?
So that was the first one, 2010.
Yeah,
that was
the first time we were in Chicago. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because the first one they cancelled us. I think we had to move out to some suburban hotel complex thing. But so I was using Tomcat embedded in my demos in 2010. And so I kind of knew that you could do it. And because of Spring Batch, actually, I also knew that there was, there were lots of people out there writing Java main methods, right, that would create a Spring application context and then run something. And there were as many different ways of doing it as there were people doing it, which is, hundreds basically. And I'd seen them all because of Spring Batch. Everywhere I went where people were using Spring Batch, they had to bootstrap, right? They had to bootstrap something. using Spring, and because there wasn't an application server, generally speaking, for those things.
Right.
They had to make up a story for how to do it. So that was really the idea that sparked it off. It was, how do you run Spring if it's not in an application server?
Right. And then
that sort of gelled everything. And then, I don't know, we just kind of got creative, right? I mean, Phil and I were both living in San Francisco, like I said, and we threw a whole load of stuff at the wall. And I think most of it stuck, didn't it? There's not very much that we put in.
No, I was looking through some early commits, and there's quite a lot has survived.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe the Groovy command line thing is probably one of the not survivors, but
yeah.
And that was my baby. I was quite keen on that because of Cloud Foundry, in fact.
Well, so that's what I was going to say. So at the time, we had just been acquired by VMware. This is like 2 years, 3 years, 4 years after that.
I think it was, we were into the VMware side, and I think it was coming up to the pivotal.
Almost a pivotal at that point, yeah. So Cloud Foundry had sort of become a thing, right? So I had been working on the Cloud Foundry team, and I was just kind of rolling off it just as we came into the pivotal era. So for those of you listening who don't remember the history, Spring was bought by VMware and then spun back out again as Pivotal. Yeah, Pivotal was an independent company in 2013, I guess it was. So around about the same time we were working on Spring Boot.
But it was really nice because we had continuity of leadership. We had Paul Moritz both at VMware and Pivotal, and that's the other thing is
and the Spring team was the same. Like the Spring team's always the same.
Yeah. So did Paul Moritz, like, was he knocking on the door going, I need a way to run embedded?
I think it was much more organic than that, if I remember. Like, my memory was, I think we had this issue that was raised. I think originally we were like, we should do this in framework. And then Jürgen was kind of very sort of, he let us change framework to make us do what we want. But I think it was like, no, this is like something that can't really live in the heart. And he was totally right, because, it's got to encompass all the projects anyway. So it's kind of better outside of framework.
Well, but also you were working on Spring Framework at the time, right, Phil?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Conditionals, I think there's a symbiosis there. You had to develop some stuff in Framework. Conditionals in Framework 4.
There was changes that were needed, but they weren't. The entire project didn't belong there, and I think he was right. No. And then, as I remember, like a lot of the things that I think maybe drove the right decisions was Chris was working on the Spring website at the time, and that was going to be a project that was going to be rewrite the Spring.io website. I think we just got the domain, because I think we were like Spring Framework for the longest time.
That's right. Yeah, and I was in. They actually hired Pivotal consultants to do that project, and they were in London. So I went and embedded myself in that team, which gave me a lot of nice feedback loops. I could see what they were using and what they were getting right, what they were getting wrong, and we could help them.
Yeah.
Chris was acting as project owner. So you know how the Pivotal system works, right? You have a project owner who drives the requirements but doesn't do the implementation, and that kind of that was his role. And I was in the development team.
So I don't think there was ever like a push from the top down. I think it was much more bottom up mostly.
Those things don't work so well with Spring historically. Any central decisions that get made tend to just kind of, I don't know, be bad ones or not work out very well.
This is where I think people really need to. It's not always easy, but for better or for worse, if there's a GitHub issue with 1,000 likes and there's a mandate from management just above us, the GitHub issue will probably get precedence. We tend to follow the community. I'm not saying we ignore management, quite the contrary, but on the other hand, like Spring definitely has this sort of community first sort of focus, and we're sensitive to the pain, whatever it is, that the community is feeling, and I love that. projects.
Well,
I always joke that the management was so busy like setting up the new company that they didn't have time to like notice what we were doing.
Yeah, it was kind of skunk works, wasn't it? We kind of did it under the radar. We just decided that it needed doing. It didn't really ask permission because like Spring was Phil was on the framework team. Like he didn't have permission to go and do something else. I was a little bit of a loose ends, but because I'd finished on the Cloud Foundry thing I was doing, but yeah, that's probably why I did so much of the initial. You know, I think I probably did about 50% of the first release.
Yeah,
and Phil did like 48%. But there were quite a few people who got involved. Chris Beam's a tiny bit at the beginning, right? And I think Andy Wilkinson was probably the first.
Yeah, I was trying. I can't. My memory's terrible. Like if I find an issue in GitHub, I sometimes.
What was Andy doing before? Was he still working on DM Server?
Oh no!
I mean that still existed, I think. So I think maybe he was. I don't know what else he was doing, right?
Yeah, maybe the OSGI. Stuff,
and that was coming to an end, so we snapped him up because like Andy's one of the smartest people in the universe.
In the universe, yeah.
And he still works on Spring Boot, as you know, just like Phil. It's amazing
and appreciated, by the way. And so then I think a lot of really good. So at the time, there's a lot of inspiration, but and there's lots of little data points you could point to. You mentioned the community, which I think is paramount in all things that we do, but also you two are well steeped and the community is well steeped in sort of the zeitgeist of cloud computing and cloud centric software at the time. So we had a number of influences, and I mean, let's just talk about a few of them. How did or did not things like Spring Roo, Grails, Drop Wizard, did any of these things figure into what would become Spring Boot? And then also likewise, what about the 12-factor manifesto? That was sort of out there. That was Heroku's thing. We didn't have the microservices pushed just yet, but it was coming,
Interestingly, I think when we were naming Spring Boot, we were talking about that just 5 minutes ago. We also talked about microservices. And it wasn't actually a thing then, I don't think, quite. I mean, like the word existed. You could probably find it in the technical dictionary, but people weren't using it very much. So I don't know. Maybe you can blame us a little bit for how big microservices became in the end. I'm sorry for that.
No, I'm not.
But no, because I think Adrian Collier came and Alexis were talking to me about the names of things.
Richardson.
And Richardson, that's right, Alexis Richardson, that's right. We were talking about Spring 0 as it was at the time, Spring Bootstrap, whatever it was called, and what could we call it? Spring Boot. And we needed a hook to throw it on. Like, how would you describe what you're doing? And I think it was Alexis. He said to me, "So, what do you think about this microservices thing? Is that what we're doing?" And I went, "Nah, I don't think so. I don't like that. I don't like it. There's too much hype."
Yeah, we were quite intentional about like not putting microservices.
We never used the word microservice. That's right. Yeah, other people did, which is fine, but yeah, we never did.
No, we were definitely inspired by other projects, though. I think a lot.
Yeah. If they hadn't existed, we wouldn't have.
Drop Wizard for sure. Ruby on Rails. I think you did because you just come from a lot of Ruby work, hadn't you? So I think you were.
I didn't like Rails much, but I was inspired by Sinatra. That was a Ruby web framework that was very common in the Cloud Foundry ecosystem. Yeah. What I liked about that was that you could. I remember showing it to lots of people, but Luke Taylor. Do you remember Luke Taylor? He used to be the Spring security lead. Yeah. So he and I worked together on the Cloud Foundry. What's it called? UAA.
Oh, the OAuth IDP.
The OAuth server. Yeah. And so I must have still been on that team, I guess, when I started. I showed this thing to Luke. I said, "Look, this is Ruby. I can run a web server. It's 3 lines of code." And it says "Hello World" to on port 8080. I said, why can't I do that in the Spring?
Yeah.
So there you go. That was that was one of the founding ideas, I suppose, is copying other people's ideas.
Really?
we didn't do anything ourselves. We just copied other people, and Sinatra was one of them.
Sinatra, Drop Wizard. We'll talk about that. I want to come back to like production worthy software in a second here, because that was we did mention that from the jump, right? Like, but so you mentioned Sinatra and sort of this embeddable web server thing, and we didn't. So for the longest time, you couldn't embed Tomcat. You could embed Jetty, but then we had Tomcat embeddable. Like you mentioned, you were using it as far as back as 2010.
Yeah, it had existed for a few years, but it was just sort of getting to the point where it was a regular part of their release process, and it was being properly supported by the Apache community. Yeah. And we had Tomcat already as a product in VMware, right? So the Spring team was already working on Tomcat, so that was our first choice of web server. But we also, even from the beginning, we had Jetty, right?
Right. Oh yeah. Well, that was the one that Drop Wizard was using, was Jetty, and
So we copied them basically. Yeah.
Oh, and so it's we had so we talked about these sort of embeddable web services, and that was a really big deal, because now your deployment is the thing you write. It's the thing you check into GitHub, right? It's like it's just fewer moving pieces, and then we get to that other thing, which is, okay, if I'm deploying the web service, what else do I need that I would have otherwise got from this outer wrapper that was the application server, ye old application server, and indeed what things are missing from ye old application server, and again, that production worthiness thing. The Drop Wizard had Drop Wizard metrics, right? And remember that?
Yeah. So we actually used that as a library in the Spring Boot
1.0,
didn't we? Yeah, that was our observability solution, was basically Drop Wizard. I think that was only an alternative. It wasn't the only one, but it was kind of the main one.
There's another one?
Well, I mean, you could always just use JMX. What was that? JMX, the console thing that you
the crash shell.
Yeah. That's right.
So
you could
cool.
do it in a shell. Yeah.
I missed that so much. Oh, that was great.
That was a security nightmare, but yeah.
But it was such a cool demo. Like, that was the thing that sold it to me. I mean, I saw all the demos. I'm like, wow, this is definitely better than what I was doing. But then I realized it wasn't just like, oh, hey, we can activate a library on the class path. And by the way, that's another thing, service loaders. It's a thing in the JDK since Java 7 or something, and then Spring had its own service loader that you could plug into that delegated and turned to the JDK one, I think. But basically, I don't know that we used it all that much before Spring Boot, and then suddenly it's like, well, this is the most obvious thing in the world. I had a library, and it does something. That's it. That's the cue.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it was an idea that was sitting there in the Spring framework, like you said, I think almost from the beginning, right? So there's quite a few places in Spring Framework where they kind of bootstrap from the class path, like in the MVC, right? The original part, Spring Framework feature was MVC, and I think the dispatcher servlet has always sort of just grabbed stuff from properties files if it can. And so Spring.factories, meta-imp Spring.factories, that was just there, and it wasn't being used very much, and so we just kind of piggybacked on it. And it's almost all Spring Boot now, right? I mean,
right?
Yeah. In fact, Spring Boot even split off its own specialized versions of the same mechanism, but that was already there in Spring, like from the beginning. I think 20 years ago, right?
Yeah, it was definitely there.
Such a good idea, and that combined. So the queue, the developer, the way you said, because we had this whole debate in the Spring and Java community around convention over configuration, right? The Rails people were saying no, convention over configuration. Actually, to their sort of half credit, the J2E people were saying convention over configuration, but clearly that was, you want some configuration, otherwise it's completely inflexible. So and then the same thing for Ruby. You could have some configuration, but it meant you had to start from zero. you want out of the off the rails.
And we borrowed from all of those, definitely. I mean, Spring Framework also had a big convention over configuration movement. In fact, I remember Rob Harrop talking about that back in wasn't even Spring 2, one of the main themes was convention over configuration, I seem to remember. Was that when we introduced the at controller annotations?
That's 2.5.
The at request, that was 2.5, was it? Yeah, I can remember that being a big theme. And, there was at enable web MVC. That's a convention over configuration, implementation, right? That is basically copying ideas from Ruby on Rails.
But the signal there was an annotation, and so you had to.
Yeah. I mean, but there are ideas. The point I'm making is there are ideas like that littered all over Spring Framework and other Spring projects, Spring integration, annotation-driven. Conventions, lots of stuff in there. All we did with Spring Boot was kind of take it to the next level, and I suppose it did create a little bit of tension because. One of the things we had to say, right, for new Spring Boot users was don't use at enable web MVC, right? That's already convention over configuration, but it doesn't go far enough for us. We want you to use at enable auto configuration instead.
So why didn't you take your own advice, Doc? Why did at enable batch processing trigger the Spring Batch Starter?
Well, that's an example of one of that tension I was talking about, right? So we didn't know at the beginning what to include in auto configuration and what we should require an annotation to signal us that we had to do something. So I think the balance has sort of shifted now, mostly, hasn't it, Phil? I don't know. It feels like everything that's on the class path is used instead.
I think when there's a clear signal.
I mean, that's the metric. Is there a signal the user wants to have a batch process? Yeah.
Right.
And so, I think as well, there's a lot of, when you go back 10 years and you're trying to get traction with something, there's a lot of decisions that you have to make for that point in time, and now it's kind of an obvious pattern and it's not such a big problem. But back then it was like, we weren't sure which way it was going.
We weren't sure which way it was going to go. Like I said, we threw a lot of things at the wall, and that was, auto configuration was one of the things that we threw at the wall. We could have, if it had been a bad idea and people hadn't liked it, we could have backed out of it, right? Because it wasn't actually fundamental. It was just a feature.
It's still in a separate jar.
Exactly. Yeah. No, it's intentionally there so that you don't have to use it if you don't want to.
I can't imagine not at this point.
I think most people are probably on board with that now. But I mean, even in the Spring team at the beginning, a lot of people were like, "Well, why do you do that? Why can't I just create my own configuration? I'm quite happy doing that. Thank you very much."
Right.
This Spring Boot thing, it'll never catch on. Even within our own team, people didn't get it, but I think they all do now.
Yeah. Well, okay. So that's another really interesting sort of I don't want to get ahead of myself. I do want to talk about that because right now we actually have several projects that build atop Spring Boot, but let's come back to that because we mentioned the embedded web servers, and we mentioned that there was obviously some cues from the community, some sort of prior art, but there's some other things that were like again, there's just so many things that you all got right from the jump, and one was the starters that paired with conditionals that paired with service loaders, the three of them creating something called autoconfig. Brilliant. But the environment that was in Spring Framework 3, right, that wasn't there for boot, but it just seemed like such a natural mechanism once we had boot.
Abstraction, yeah. I mean, you have to say Spring got it right first, and then we just used a bunch of that stuff to implement some neat things.
We had such a good pool of projects as well to like. It's almost embarrassing because people say, oh, it's it does all this stuff, but there was like all this groundwork that was already done, and all we were doing was like the last mile, like making the configuration of it easier.
I mean, that's always the case with Spring, right? We're always just the layer on top. It's just the icing on the cake. Everything is
best of breed ecosystem stuff.
Yeah. We just use things that other people wrote most of the time.
Yep. What was the first auto configuration starter ensemble, Dave?
Yeah, I guess Tomcat and WebMVC.
No, I thought you were going to say Batch. I thought that was the one.
No, because I wanted my Sinatra app, right? I wanted to write 3 lines of code and have an HTTP endpoint.
And insofar as it's now 0 lines of code, you 300%ed it. It was great. Well done. And then a couple other things you got right, both of you. And it's the template for so much that has come since. Start.spring.io. I know we have seen projects on which you can incept your new thing before, websites in which you could incept your thing, and there were certainly command line tools, but start.spring.io.
Yeah, it wasn't a new idea. I mean, it was copying somebody else's as usual. That was me. We had a couple. I think they're still running, right? Those old versions of start.spring.io that we resurrected for the keynote last year at Spring One. It was interesting to see how it evolved. The interface evolved, and Brian DeSo was just saying on Twitter the other day, it's amazing how long it ran with just that kind of white frame. Yeah. No styling. There was a CSS file, I think, but it was really basic. It was that was my CSS. That wasn't one that any professional UI developer wrote. I think it ran for 5 years on that.
What always blew me away, because the experience of the website is one thing, but the most powerful thing I think was it's also a web service. So that was from the get-go. You could always curl it and get a tarball, right? So you could always do curl start.spring.io/starter.tgz and then pipe to tar, unpack it, and you're gone. You go. Because I'm a Unix command line guy, right? And I wanted that to work. When the tooling people came a knocking, right? That was a natural thing to point them to and say, hey.
The Eclipse and the IntelliJ people, yeah.
And now Visual Studio Code and NetBeans, everything. It's all just talking to the same wizard. So
yeah, I think it was probably more successful by a large margin because they got on board. If it wasn't available in people's IDEs, I'm not sure it would have really worked out quite so well.
Right. Yeah.
Although you use it and your demos, you just use the website, don't you?
You know why? Because I use. So do you remember we have the wonderful Spring Tool Suite Eclipse distribution, amazing, very good. But I was very keen on making sure people understood that you didn't need to use a blessed distribution. It was
a website. Yeah. It
was just public static void main. You didn't even need WTP. You didn't need our Spring Roo shell like we had before. It's a special shell inside of Eclipse that only worked inside of Eclipse. It was just any public static void main IDE with Maven support would do fine. And the generation itself also was just a website. So you didn't need anything expensive or proprietary, or you could use Emacs and start.spring.io, Perl and Emacs if you want. And I know you do, right? I did that all the time just to make sure people understand. But now IntelliJ has this really good support, and I hope people they don't understand. I wasn't trying to show IntelliJ's great support in 2024. I was trying to show the complete lack of support in 2014. So that's another thing is GitHub. What role? Because remember that was
GitHub was kind of a new thing at that point. I think we started using GitHub in about before 2012, right? So probably 2010, 2011.
But I remember this was the first one where we used GitHub issues and not Jira.
It probably was actually. Yeah, that was definitely one thing that I was very keen on.
We used the Pivotal Tracker at the beginning, didn't we?
We did?
When we were, yeah. If you look at the old history, there's a lot of it is tracker numbers.
Oh, because it was the website project.
Oh, right.
Yeah. You're probably right.
But then when it went public, we were on GitHub. I think we must have been near the start because they did framework. like migrated away from Jira at some point, didn't they, with a big script?
Yeah, but that was much later. I think you're right. Yeah, you're right, Josh. We were the first ones because I could see that it was going to snag more community contributors, right? If you use GitHub issues, it's much closer to the code than Jira. That's what I liked about it. So I was quite keen on the idea.
Has it been the success? Has GitHub been? I mean, I'm sure we all have our issues. Everything has issues, but I mean, Phil, you're still. Dave has sauntered off into other projects since, but Phil, you're still very much mired in the world of Spring Boot. You're the lead today, and I mean, how has GitHub still served you? Like, do you feel like you're getting?
Yeah, very. It's one of those interesting things because I know when we were first migrating to GitHub, there was a lot of like, well, Jira lets you assign like multiple milestones and various other things that, you know, on paper, maybe if you look at GitHub issues, it's like not as powerful as Jira, which is probably true. But the integration and the fact that like the community kind of went there, I think is why GitHub became so powerful. So it was like it was better to work around the issues, develop your own tooling to kind of work around the limitations of GitHub issues because everyone's there. You know, once you're there, it's like it's so easy to create an issue. And at the time, I don't think Jira was even centralized. You know, so you quite often, if you wanted to raise an issue with something, it would be like, oh, I've got to go to their Jira and sign up an account, and GitHub just removed this one small layer of friction, and I think it just really helped with just having people engage in the project. I still think that's the case.
Yeah, it did.
Huge, and that was one of the metrics that I remember looking at in the very beginning, and it was so much engagement. I mean, Spring Framework was always a huge project. Open source, one of the most visible projects in the Java community, if not the most, save perhaps Log4j or JUnit. I mean, it's just extraordinarily visible. And that was before. That was with Subversion and patch files and CVS and Jira. And then we moved to GitHub, and I remember the numbers just, the stars, the commits, the issues, the pull requests, all of it. It can be an explosion, really amazing.
I just looked up the first issue. Issue number 1 is from Greg, May 22nd, 2013. Fixing a typo in the name of an annotation, which is probably
really May 2013.
Probably my work because I'm quite good at introducing typos.
That's surprising it wasn't before that, actually.
Yeah, I mean, but that might be because we moved to a different. I think we had a private repo for a while,
maybe.
So maybe that's the first one on the public repo.
So we didn't save the issues. We saved the commit history, but not the issues. Yeah, I guess maybe that's right.
Yeah, 40,000 forks on it at the moment, 72,000 stars. And my favorite one is the contributors. It's got like 1,082 contributors, which is like pretty nice.
Well done. Yeah.
I think a lot of that is some of the design decisions like really help with contributions because once you got the pattern of auto configuration and stuff, it was pretty easy for people to like develop those things and say, here's one for this other project. So I think, a lot of those contributors are other Spring team members, like having good support for their own stuff.
I remember in the very beginning, not the very beginning, but like pretty quickly thereafter, in the successive months thereafter, I remember Stefan, I think it was Stefan Nicole, our pal on the Spring Framework team these days, but he wrote a document basically saying, okay, this is what it looks like to build, we didn't call it a plugin, like an auto configuration, a starter or whatever, to extend Spring Boot. It's got a starter, it's got auto config, it's got configuration properties, it's got, ABC. And it was just sort of very clear. If you wanted to add more Spring Boot to Spring Boot, you did this. And it was just like such a useful thing, because now you knew the dimensions of extensibility. And we were very clear about that,
A lot of people do that, of course, now.
Oh, yeah.
Netflix being one of the first big companies to take it and run with it. Yeah. Build your own framework on top of Spring Boot.
And we'll talk about that in a second because I have questions there. But I do want to quickly, because you were mentioning Jira a second ago, I do want to quickly shout out the most unsung hero in the entire team and arguably the entire planet, which is Trevor, who, like, for every good day we have, there's probably 2 or 3 bad days that he had to have to make it that way, right? Like the guy is just, he's our, I don't know what is he?
I think he's a robot, isn't he? Because he's always awake.
He's always awake. He's the human being that makes sure that the infrastructure required for all of us,
we spoke about like top down versus bottom up,
right?
Development, and fortunately or unfortunately, like all of the Spring teams have got their own like way of doing things. So like if you want to use Maven or Gradle or Jenkins, or we used Concourse for a while, GitHub Actions, what was the other one? Bamboo,
right?
And we make all these decisions at an engineering level, and I don't think we really appreciate the impact it has on the poor person who's got
who's running the infrastructure. Yeah, that's true.
Luckily, I think we're sort of getting less and less of those. Like we've moved
for now.
Everyone's moved off Bamboo now,
right? Okay. Anyway, so back to that. You mentioned what happened was we had this well-known pattern for extending Spring Boot, and that, of course, like you said, large, not just us, but externally, large organizations like Netflix started building upon that, and that created this wonderfully virtuous cycle. And of course, we now have a number of projects, even within the Spring ecosystem, in the core Spring ecosystem. I don't know how to describe it. The nuclei of the Spring universe. Before it was like Spring Boot sat atop everything else and integrated and pulled in all those other things. And then nowadays you have Spring AI, Spring Modulith, and of course the original Spring Cloud, which all sat on top of Spring Boot. And then going beyond that, you have the ecosystem. You have Spring Cloud GCP, you have Spring Cloud, the Netflix stuff. You have Spring Cloud AWS, Alibaba, Azure, right? All these like huge projects that are ecosystems unto themselves, and they're all auto configuration first. So Spring Boot couldn't pull those in. What was our dilemma? Like, why did we? At what point did we decide Spring Boot shouldn't arrange Spring Cloud, and we should let Spring Cloud arrange itself? But Spring Boot should manage that.
That's a difficult process, actually, because you're in great danger of creating dependency cycles and maintenance release headaches. Like, so there's an order of things that you have to release now. So you have to do Spring Framework, then Spring Boot, then Spring Cloud, and you can't do it in a different order because that's the order of dependencies, and that does create some friction, right? I mean, it's a big headache for us as maintainers of the system. So anybody who's doing the same thing is going to have the same headaches, right? So if you want to build something which is building on top of Spring Boot, then you have to wait for Spring Boot to release the latest version. You can't do it as soon as Spring Framework's out, right? So it has some negative impacts, the way that you organize things like that. In some ways it would be much simpler if it was all just 2 layers, or even just one, but then nobody wants a mono repo for Spring, I don't think, either, because the reason that we have it the way we have it, right, is for expediency reason. At the time that you're developing something new,
right,
you need to be able to move as fast as possible, so you need to be able to iterate. And so you can't be waiting, everybody can't be on the same train, because some people need to move faster than others. So that's the reason that it's the shape it is now.
Yeah.
I don't know whether it would always have to be that way, but it's kind of, that things sit into their own mold, right? And it's going to be quite hard to get it out now.
Well, I think so. Now we've since shifted to a 6-month cadence for so much. So I remember Spring Cloud. That was the reason, right? Was the cloud infrastructure, microservice space was moving much more expeditiously than Spring Boot or Spring Framework, which seemed to be
necessarily. Yeah, and it was a new thing, so we had to move faster, when we started that.
Yeah. But had you to do it again today with a 6-month cadence for Spring Boot, would Spring Cloud still have been its own thing atop that? I think it works out fine either way, but I'm just wondering.
it's too big in some ways to be the same thing. So that's the other tension, right? So you want things to be small and iteratable, but but at the same time you want things to be loosely coupled. And you can't have both, and you also want to have like a what's the word, coherence, right? So like everything makes sense. You can make a plan that says that I want to make this change here, and it'll eventually ripple through to the Spring Cloud layer. I don't know. You can't. Too many. It's like get back to microservices, right? The microservice hell, they call it, right? When you have too many,
right?
So you can have too many moving parts, but you can have too few as well, right? So that's the big ball of mud. So you want to be somewhere between a big ball of mud and microservice hell. And so that's what we're trying to do, I suppose. And whether we've made all the right decisions all the time, I don't know, but we're somewhere in the middle there.
I think you did a great job, and the reason I think about it is because I think about poor Spencer, who is our envoy to all the Spring Cloud projects that build atop. Spencer Gibb, lead of Spring Cloud these days. He's like poor Phil. He has to integrate with everything beneath Spring Boot, right? He's got to liaise schedules with all of Spring underneath, right? But then there's poor Spencer, who has to work with all the people building on top of Spring Cloud, right? And that's equally a big, I imagine like a horizontal line. Spring Boot's right in the middle, and then below that is you've got Spring Security. And then
it's almost a fan shape, isn't it? It's not, right. I guess maybe not quite, but I mean, the way you keep it sane is, of course, to manage the boundaries, right? As always, it's all about.
I would say that's one of the biggest reasons why, like, a mono repo wouldn't. A lot of people use the mono repo so that when something is changed, it breaks the entire thing, and you work through.
And everybody notices. Yeah,
but we haven't. We can never be like that because people use our stuff. In enterprises, in other open source projects. So we're always going to have like a back compatibility issue. We can't just break things. I mean, it's a very different way of working. So I think that's why the separate repos work so well for Spring projects.
The discipline is better, isn't it? It forces you to think about the impact of the changes you're making.
Yeah.
And we've been blessed because by its very definition, the surface area of Spring Boot is actually less than the projects that it integrates, because it's just auto config. You could do nothing. Your queue to the framework, your signal to the framework is just, I have a library in the class path, and who cares how it provides the web server? The objects that congeal together to make the running process that is import 880. It can change.
That's fundamental for the whole pattern that we invented with Spring Boot. Is like adapting to what's on the class path, but also using that as an abstraction layer, so that if you don't care about it, then when it changes, you don't care.
Really nice. I mean, some things have changed. Obviously, we introduced micrometer in 2.0. That was a bit of a jump compared to Drop Wizard metrics, but it basically, it's just the curl output from the HTTP actuator endpoint. Which gets us around to the observability. We talked about the actuator. We talked about yield, Crash Shell, rest in peace.
Which looks a little bit like Ruby on Rails shell as well, by the way. It
was?
CLI. Yeah. I was kind of slightly inspired by that.
Oh gosh, it was such a good project.
Not enough to write something myself. I just stole it from Crash, but anyway, yeah.
Right, but it was such a cool thing because again, I did nothing, and then suddenly there's an SSH console I could log into that gave me every bit of information I ever wanted. It's like, well, that's when I realized, oh wow, this is not just a web server or whatever. And then you get to Spring Cloud, and now you've got a whole centralized config server and a centralized your load balancer and a discovery service. I mean, it just, that mechanism is so it tickles the mind what you can do with it. Okay, so we get to Spring Boot. We've got the microservice movement. We've got auto config. We talked about the relevance and use of GitHub, the social sort of platform there. and we talked about these big projects that use auto configuration. I guess I'm also kind of curious about what it looks like for you as the integration. We had like, okay, I think about MyBetis. MyBetis has a core Spring library, but also has an auto config, right? And so what was that like? It was not all these projects came out of the woodworks, and it wasn't like we helped whenever we could, but it was just amazing to see all these projects that had formerly maybe not had an integration with Spring, or they did, but it wasn't, it was just minimal. It was just Spring framework. All these projects came out of the woodworks, and they had auto configs, right? And so that's why I'm very careful to talk about Spring in terms of the core team, but also acknowledging there's this huge ecosystem of auto configs out there. Has that been more work than you thought it would have been? I mean, just maintaining those ecosystem integrations or liaising with those groups of people building their integrations. We talked about Spencer, but even within Spring Boot as the the layer, I don't know. You see what I'm saying? There's a lot there. There's a lot of people that are building.
I think it was one thing that sort of surprised me was the it's almost like become an accidental API because
right.
I think we kind of considered auto configuration, although it's public classes, to be somewhat the way that we do things, and suddenly those ideas kind of went out and third parties started using them, and then that did kind of constrain us a little bit with the way we wanted to evolve it. I know we changed, like we talked about Spring Factories, and we changed that recently to another mechanism, and then for a couple of releases I think we were trying to support both. So I guess it's like a blessing and a curse. It's great that we don't have to do everything, and we can say you go and your project, you do the auto configuration for that, but then at the same time it does make it hard sometimes to evolve stuff,
to change anything. So I think that it's worth it though, isn't it? The force multiplier is huge, because
for sure.
There's only a very small number of people actually working on Spring Boot itself, but they have a huge leverage out to a vast number of, like you say, Josh, projects that we actually probably don't even know about.
Right.
And but people can extend in ways that we hoped they would, but we didn't control it in any way. We don't actually, I don't think, have a lot of active contact with people like MyBetis. It's great that they're doing it.
Right.
We love it. But
we often get, one of the harder parts of running the project is sometimes people put effort in and suggest things, or do pull requests, and you have to kind of say, no, I don't really want to take this on within the core. And I think Spring's always been like that. It's about, sometimes it's about dialing it back and saying, okay, but if we offered you this hook point, could you do what you want?
Could you do it?
Another method, another bean, another thing.
There are some compromises that you have to make, because you can't actually support everything all the time.
No, especially not with the team size we have.
The team, I don't think people realize it's like, what is it, 5 people? I mean, it's really small, right? It's a very small team of people that are just really they're punching well above their weight, so to speak. Obviously,
I don't think it's ever been any bigger, has it?
Not really, no. I mean, it's sometimes got to 6, I think.
Well, okay, we're kind of winding down here. It's time for some retrospective navel gazing. Like you mentioned, bringing on another person. The only reason I can think of that we would have done that is because we had a particularly difficult climb for something, right? And so I guess my question then is, what was the most difficult in the last 10 years? If you had to to bring Spring Boot forward, what was the thing that was like, oh, this is more work than we thought it was going to be, right? Whatever that was.
For me, it coincides with the major releases. I think 2.0, it was reactive.
Oh yeah,
it was a big effort.
Yeah, because everybody had to do something. It wasn't just the Spring Boot team that touched, right?
No.
With these things, that tends to be what it is. And native images, I suppose, is the one after that.
Huge lift.
Where everybody had to do some work to make that happen. not just it didn't just hit Spring Boot; it hit everything.
Right. Did you think it would go this far? It's been 10 years and it's still going stronger than ever. I'm not surprised, but I am grateful. I mean,
Well, it's like we said at the beginning. It's like having children, right? You kind of hope that they're going to survive. You do everything you can.
Yes. But I mean, being like, we've been very lucky. It's 20 years of Spring Framework, and it's still obviously very strong. In 10 years of Spring Boot, very strong.
It'll be going to university soon.
Yeah. So, but then you look around, you're like, okay, most Java projects don't last anywhere near that long. I was in the conversation with Jürgen and Rod a couple weeks ago. There was this discussion. I mean, this whole sort of like, it's 20 years. I mean, even the things that we thought would be there forever, the mainstays, things like struts have since come and gone, and yet we've been lucky. I'm sure there's a lot of it is luck, not all of it, but a lot of it, so I don't know. Does it blow your mind, or are you just kind of like, what are your thoughts? Do you think it's going to endure another 20 years?
I mean, me personally, I just take it one day at a time and don't think about that stuff. Because if I think about it, it's very stressful. Like if you think about people that are running, I'll tell you a story about the embedded web server stuff has got this like chicken and egg problem where the application context can have like servlet classes in it if it's a servlet one, but we have to start the web server. And it's kind of like it does this weird dance where it kind of starts the web server and then sort of retrofills itself. And for like the first 5 years, at least, of Spring Boot, I was convinced that there was some fundamental flaw in that process. It was like, It was like, when you're at university and you got exams coming up and you sometimes wake up in a sweat and you're like, oh, I've got an exam. And it's like, no, wait, I've been working, I've been out of university for 10 years or something. It's like that same pressure. So I try not to think about like where you think about financial institutions, or it could be running in, Netflix, or if you think about all that stuff, it's kind of overwhelming. So one day at a time, fix it. It's the way to go.
Yeah. And it is, I mean, everybody is using it, right? It is now, I mean, if you're using Java statistically, unless you're doing like Android, you're probably using Spring Boot. Don't think about it, Phil. Just ignore that. Okay. If a very serious question here, if you had to pick, which one of you is Paul and which one of you is John?
Well, you can't do that.
I mean, we can, and I will. Demanding, inquiring minds want to know.
I knew you were going to ask this. I've been thinking about it quite a lot. I'd like to be Ringo. I want to just be in the background.
You want to be Ringo? That's good.
Yeah, Ringo.
Can I be George then?
I think that's too much pressure. I want to be Ringo in a Beatles tribute band. That would be fine by me. just getting by.
Whose brilliant idea was it to add ASCII rook? My favorite feature.
I don't think it was ever up for discussion. I mean, that's.
No, like, I don't know. I can't remember. It might not have been either.
I remember I did the Leaflet logo. It took me ages.
Yeah, I remember you did the actual default banner thing. Yeah.
But I don't think it was ever up for a discussion about whether we were going to have I think it just appeared one day and everyone was like, okay. I think
did we copy that idea from anybody, or did we make that one up? I can't remember.
I'm pretty sure Drop Wizard had banners.
Did it? Okay.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
We never make anything up ourselves. We borrow it from someone else.
Well, you're being overly modest. I remember Rod back in the day. He would say, like, look, we only write the code for the things for which there's not already something that works. If we can integrate that, we will. And
yes,
that's the Spring MO.
That's the philosophy.
Yeah. Okay. I'm trying to be mindful of Dave's time here. I know you're 8 hours plus time zone wise.
Yeah, it's been fun. I mean, we don't want to go on too long. It gets boring after a while for everybody else as well.
Quite the contrary. But if you had to, are either of you on the internet? And if so, do you want to be found? And if so, where can you be?
Yeah, I suppose I'm quite often on the internet. Yes. You mean social media?
Anything. GitHub. You know, you're.
I'm on GitHub. Syer. Yeah, that's the best place to find me. I honestly I don't know how GitHub notifications work. Sometimes I get them, sometimes I don't. So that it's worth a try. I still use Twitter. I don't know if anybody else does, but
I do.
I still use Twitter. I don't like the way it is anymore, but yeah, I still get quite a lot of useful information from it. So I'm still on there. I'm David_Syer.
Okay, and then Phil.
Yeah, Philip_Webb. I'm a lurker on Twitter, but not really. Try not to contribute to the cesspool.
I try not to be too visible. People just shout at you. The more you're visible, the more you get shouted at. But I don't mind reading other people's things.
Hold on, I'm pasting this. It's going. It's happening. There we go. I did it. All right, gentlemen. Thank you for 10 amazing. Well, more than 10. I mean, we just talked about it. Right? It's been at least 12 years since conception of the idea to now.
Yeah, I think we can give it 10 years.
Fine.
Give it another 10 years.
I'll be there.
Yeah, probably.
I'll probably have to get another shirt though.
Talking about the project or this interview, because I can't say.
Oh, fine, it's over. Get out of here. Look at this. We got some. Look at that. There you go. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone for showing up.
Really
if you're watching it on replay.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Have a great one.